Welcome to Gov Conversations. I'm Leslie Stefanik, Marketing Director at Deltek, and today I'm speaking with Adam Eastridge from Aronson's Government Contracting Services Group, and we're talking about executive compensation. Welcome, Adam.
Thank you for having me.
There's been a lot of discussion regarding executive compensation recently. Can you give me a little bit of background on what the recent limits mean to government contractors?
Sure. The Federal Acquisition Regulation limits the amount of compensation that a contractor can bill to the government under cost reimbursable contracts. Compensation in this context is defined as bonuses, basic wages, and deferred compensation. Therefore, if a company pays an employee a compensation that exceeds the limit, the company needs to ensure that they treat that excess compensation as an unallowable cost. Further, the unallowable cost is an expressly unallowable cost. Therefore, the company needs to ensure they account for it properly. Otherwise, the administrative contracting officer could assess penalties associated with that excess compensation.
There have been recent changes to the limits. Can you explain what these changes are and the effect on federal contractors?
Certainly. There's been three recent notable changes. The first occurred in December 2011. At that time, the compensation limit became applicable to all employees for certain Department of Defense, NASA, and Coast Guard contracts. Prior to that point, the compensation limit was applicable to only the top 5 employees in management positions. The second notable change occurred June of 2014. At this time, the compensation limit became applicable to all employees for certain civil contracts. Prior to that time, the compensation limit was only applicable to the top 5 employees in management positions. The third change also occurred in June of 2014. At this time, the compensation limit amount changed for contracts awarded after June 2014. Therefore, in the calendar year 2014, you have 2 compensation amounts, and contractors need to understand how to apply those limits to the contracts. The key to appropriately apply the limits to the contracts is to understand when your contracts were awarded, so the contract award date. And this is further reason to ensure that companies have a good contract system so that at any point in time they can readily identify the contract award date for their contracts.
Do you have any suggestions on how contractors can implement these changes in an efficient manner?
Yes, and with the recent changes, there's been a lot of added complexity. And fortunately, the federal government acknowledged this complexity. It issued guidance in October 2014. And the additional complexity was caused by the fact companies would have to create additional indirect rates simply to be able to comply with the compensation limits. The guidance that came out from the Department of Defense in October of 2014 now permits companies to use a single blended rate opposed to the multiple rates. If a company chooses to use a single blended rate, they must enter into an advanced agreement with their administrative contracting officer. This advanced agreement would then determine what the blended rate is that should be used for both billing as well as proposing. One thing to remember for companies is when they're developing the blended rate must be based on a weighted average of the contract volume.
If the contractor pays the employee below the limit, is the cost automatically allowable?
Excellent question. Even when a company pays an employee below the compensation limit, does not automatically make that cost allowable. In order for the cost to be allowable, it still needs to be reasonable. And contractors have the burden of proof to demonstrate that the cost is reasonable. The best way to ensure that all of the contractor's compensation cost is reasonable is to ensure the company has a strong compensation plan. The strong compensation plan should include external factors such as the geography, the location, as well as the competitors. In addition to internal factors such as looking at the employees in the company to ensure there's equity in pay. And further, the Metron court case is an excellent example of how a strong compensation plan can really prevail in a challenge by the government that the company's compensation plan or compensation cost is unreasonable.
So in summary, what are some of the key items a contractor should consider when claiming compensation?
The first that they should understand is, do I have contracts that require me to comply with these compensation limits? If they do, the second question would be, does it make sense, economic sense for the company to enter into an advanced agreement with their contracting officer and use a single blended rate, or is it better to use the multiple rate approach? Lastly, it's important to understand that even when a compensation amount is below the limit, it still needs to be proven that the cost is reasonable. And the best way to do this is to ensure the company has a strong compensation plan.
Thanks very much for your time today, Adam.
Thank you for having me.